"That bum has another!" the little beggar girl shrieked, pointing at the millionaire's wife in the cemetery. Then the girl pointed at a man. Everyone looked and saw something that made the millionaire cry on his knees. Rate my story from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The cry echoed through the hot afternoon in the historic town, shattering the heavy silence that hung over the cobblestone streets. The 52-year-old man nearly dropped his coffee cup, instinctively backing away from the window of his luxurious apartment. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the faded yellow two-story building with peeling paint that stood across from his modern high-rise. He straightened his tie before returning to work, muttering to himself that it must be some kid throwing a tantrum. As the owner of one of the largest construction companies in the region, he was used to solving complex building and investment problems, but he preferred to stay away from other people's dramas. Especially after 5 years of living alone. Since he lost his partner on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. Across the street, inside the old house, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her big eyes fixed on the worn wooden floor. The 38-year-old woman held a metal spoon firmly, which she had heated on the electric stove, her eyes red from alcohol fixed on the child who was trembling before her. The spoon came down hard on the small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her delicate skin. The girl bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that screams only made the woman who took care of her angrier, the one who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The child closed her eyes and tried to remember the gentle voice of the one who used to rock her to sleep, singing that song before everything changed. It was all that was left now, fragments of memories, and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind in the most painful moments. The woman put the spoon back in the drawer, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The girl ran to the small room in the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum that song softly, the only thing that still comforted her. The man stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound coming from the house across the street. He knew that song. His late wife used to sing it when she cooked, a popular song that talked about free birds. He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the old building. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, shaky but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. In the house next door to the faded yellow building, the 61-year-old retired schoolteacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. During her 40 years of teaching, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. She watched the windows of the house where the family she had known for decades lived. The woman who lived there had always been problematic, but since she had taken custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in town. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had spoken properly with her, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little girl better. The construction company owner remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories that he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a kind employee who had resigned abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the accident that changed his life forever. She was a gentle woman, always humming while organizing the company's files. Then suddenly she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to be suffering in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her little fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the businessman closed the curtains and tried to get back to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what happened beyond his own windows. Night fell over the historic town, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running away from his responsibilities and a retired teacher who had never managed to ignore a child's suffering. What none of them knew yet was that that fragile voice was about to change everything, revealing buried secrets and forcing decisions that none of them were prepared to face. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical movement of the town waking up for another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that did not leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the old house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The woman opened the door with a swollen face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's binge. The teacher offered her gentlest smile, saying that she had come to pay a courtesy visit. The woman hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair, claiming that the house was a mess. The teacher took a step forward, forcing the other to back down, insisting that she would love to meet the niece. The woman's face hardened for an instant before forcing a strained smile. The girl was sick with a high fever, better not to get close. At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. She insisted that she could help, that she had experience with sick children. The answer came too quickly, too nervously. She had already taken the girl to the doctor. It was just a flu. It would pass soon. The teacher noticed the nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol that emanated from her even though it was so early. All the signs that she had learned to recognize during decades dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while having breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams where the voice of a child mingled with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the old house, a strange curiosity invaded him. The teacher finally said goodbye, but not before casting an investigative look inside the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the house, the woman slammed the door shut and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouched behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height did not allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. The woman's irritation, intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit, exploded into fury. The girl mumbled that she was thirsty, her big eyes fixed on the floor. The answer came with bitterness. If she wanted water, she could go get it in the yard. And since she liked to make so much noise, she could stay out there until she decided when she could come in. The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single oak tree. There she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal that she had found. It was always birds, small, big, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The back door was locked, leaving the girl in the yard under the strong midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to hum that song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was that melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time, he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar in that voice, in that specific song. He took his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. While recording, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His former employee used to hum that same song while she worked. She, who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. She who always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl with a specific name that he now struggled to remember. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. The child who was suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the gentle woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How had he not made that connection before? The businessman put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered his ex-employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems in the company, that he had not paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, her daughter was across the street, and from the sounds that came from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried multiplied, now including regret for not helping when she clearly needed it. At 3 in the afternoon, punctually, the screams started again. This time, the businessman did not move away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the old house, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He took his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The woman was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and she was gesturing violently towards a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time he couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? That night, the girl slept on the floor of the yard, where she had been left as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child wrapped herself in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish, wherever her mother was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since he lost his partner. His considerable fortune, his wealth built over decades, none of it seemed to have value at that moment when an innocent child was suffering a few meters away, and he remained still, watching. 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During these days, he had systematically documented the episodes of aggression, always at 3 in the afternoon, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering a few meters from her house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting a new direct visit, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from which she had the best view of the backyard of the neighboring house. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the oak tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing on the ground with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. The girl looked up and saw the old lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. The teacher returned the greeting, struggling to keep her voice steady when asking if everything was okay. The girl glanced quickly at the windows of the house before replying that yes, she was just drawing birds. When the teacher asked if she liked birds, the answer came loaded with sadness. She liked them very much because they could fly wherever they wanted. At that moment, the woman's harsh voice echoed from inside the house, calling for the girl. The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran inside the house, but not before looking back at the teacher with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the woman's voice, all confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he was able to see the yard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine fury burning in his chest. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best Sunday dress, took a tray of homemade cookies that she had prepared as a pretext, and headed back to the old house. This time, she would not take no for an answer. The woman answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by her neighbor's persistence. Before she could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades in the classroom had given her. The interior of the house was dark and smelled of mildew mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. The woman insisted that the girl was sleeping, blocking the way to the back of the house. The teacher's experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that appeared to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the electric stove, and above all, small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. Both froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. The woman said quickly that it must be the neighbor's cat, but her voice trembled slightly. The teacher smiled and nodded, but had decided she had already seen enough. As she said goodbye, she made it clear that she was always there if they needed anything. The tone made it clear that it was not just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the teacher left, the woman slammed the door shut and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl huddled behind the electric stove, trying to hide. The child had cried when she heard the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. The accusation came quickly. She was making noise. The girl protested weakly that she had not made noise, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The woman took the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble, knowing what was coming next. Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone in the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. He made a call he hadn't made in months to his personal lawyer and old college friend. He needed help with a delicate situation, he explained, watching through the window as the girl's screams echoed through the afternoon. It was about a child, and he thought it could be a matter of life and death. The lawyer agreed to come immediately. The businessman hung up the phone and remained at the window, watching the house across the street with a mixture of determination and fear. His considerable wealth, all the capital he had accumulated over the years investing in stocks and expanding his business, none of it mattered if he couldn't help that child. That night, after the woman fell asleep drunk on the living room couch, the girl managed to quietly go out into the yard. Her newborns ached, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the tree and looked at the stars, humming softly the song that connected her to memories of better times. What she didn't know was that, for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering, and that, in the next few days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. Across the street, the businessman also looked at the stars, but for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't just thinking about his own pain. He was thinking about how he could use his resources, his fortune, and his position to do something that really mattered, something that could redeem years of inaction and selfishness. The lawyer arrived at the businessman's apartment on Friday morning with a serious expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at college almost 3 decades ago, and he knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. The businessman served coffee and positioned himself next to the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. He explained that the girl who lived in the house across the street was the daughter of a former employee of his, and that she was being mistreated by the woman who took care of her. Burns, daily screams, neglect. He had recordings, evidence of what was happening. The lawyer was silent for a moment, processing the information. This was very serious. If there was evidence of child abuse, he needed to contact the authorities immediately. The businessman nodded, running his hands over his face. He knew that, but there was something else. His former employee had worked for him for 3 years, left abruptly a few months before the accident that changed his life, and he never understood why. The lawyer completed the thought. Now he felt responsible. The businessman confirmed. If he had paid more attention at the time, perhaps he could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with that woman. At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and the lawyer could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. This happened every day, confirmed the businessman, at 3 in the afternoon religiously, but sometimes also at other times. The lawyer watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that aggression disturbed him deeply. They couldn't wait any longer. He needed all those recordings today. He would contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney. That child needed to be removed from that house immediately. While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl lived another day of terror. The woman had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol at home. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the girl had made on the kitchen wall during the night. Fury exploded. How many times did she need to say not to dirty the walls? The child was a plague, a curse in that house. The girl tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why she was hated so much, why each day brought new pain. She was locked in the room until the woman decided what to do with her, and if she made even a sound, she would experience a punishment she had never experienced before. In the small and stuffy room, with only a high window that she couldn't reach, The girl curled up in the corner and began to hum that song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was that song that the retired teacher heard when she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. She had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, the marks she had seen on the child's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but filled with a sadness that broke her heart. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, she went directly to the city center, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the counselor well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. She entered the office without ceremony, saying that she needed to talk about a very serious situation. A child in danger, her neighbor. She was sure she was being mistreated. The counselor straightened up in her chair, her expression immediately becoming serious. During her 5 years at CPS, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and the teacher was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. While the teacher recounted her observations across town, the lawyer was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. The prosecutor listened attentively as he presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "It was compelling evidence," said the prosecutor, examining the videos. He would order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment. "How long would that take?" asked the lawyer, worried. "With that evidence, they could act today," replied the prosecutor. He would contact Child Protective Services now. It was like that, by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny. 2 simultaneous complaints arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. The counselor was finishing noting down the teacher's account when her phone rang. It was the prosecutor needing an urgent intervention in a specific house. There was evidence of serious child abuse. The counselor paused, her pen suspended over the paper. By chance was the address determined. Old Yellow House. "Exactly," replied the prosecutor. "How did she know?" She had just received a complaint about the same house. 2 independent sources confirmed the seriousness of the situation. At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. The counselor, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading to the street. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. The lawyer was at his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "He had done the right thing," said the lawyer, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. The businessman replied that he hoped it wasn't too late, his eyes fixed on the team that was approaching the old house. In the house, the woman had gone out to buy alcohol, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued humming softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When the counselor knocked on the door of the house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was the teacher who first heard the weak voice coming from the room in the back. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team down the hall. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl curled up in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The girl raised her big and scared eyes, not understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her. The counselor crouched down to be at the child's height, introducing herself and saying that they had come to help. The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the gentle lady who had talked to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but was quickly replaced by fear. The woman was going to be angry, she whispered. She didn't need to worry about that now, said the teacher, reaching out to the girl. They were going to leave from there. And so, After 8 months of silent suffering, the girl was finally removed from the house where she had known only pain and fear. The exit was a moment that would be etched in the memory of everyone present. The child held the teacher's hand firmly, her steps small and hesitant as she crossed the door that had been her prison for so many months. Her big eyes scanned the streets as if she were seeing the world for the first time. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene, a mixture of relief and anxiety consuming his chest. He had finally managed to do something concrete. But now a new concern haunted him. What would happen to the girl from here? He turned to the lawyer and asked the question that burned in his chest. Where were they going to take her? The answer came a few days later, when the businessman received an unexpected call from the counselor. She explained that the girl was temporarily in a foster home, but that they had discovered something extraordinary during the investigation. Among the child's few belongings, they found old documents that revealed a surprising connection. His late wife had known the girl's mother years ago during volunteer work at a community center. The two had developed a friendship, and his wife had helped financially during the difficult pregnancy. There were even records of visits to the hospital, gifts purchased, and the most touching, a letter that his wife had written but never sent, expressing the desire to help care for the child if something happened to the mother. The businessman held the phone with trembling hands as the counselor continued. His wife had kept these documents in a box of memories that he had never opened after the accident, a box that was now in the hands of the authorities as part of the investigation into the girl's situation. He hung up the phone and sat down heavily on the sofa, tears streaming down his face for the first time in 5 years. His wife had tried to help, had cared, and he never knew. The girl had not entered his life by chance. It was as if his late partner had left a last gift, a last chance to do something meaningful. In the following months, the businessman began the adoption process. It wasn't easy. There were endless evaluations, visits from social workers, questions about his motivations. But for the first time in years, he had a purpose that went beyond accumulating wealth and running from his memories. The girl visited his apartment regularly, always accompanied by the teacher who had become a constant presence in their lives. At first, the child was shy, frightened by the large and luxurious space. But little by little she began to smile, to play, to draw her birds now on colored papers that he bought especially for her. A year after the intervention, on a sunny afternoon, the businessman received the official news. The adoption had been approved. He was now legally responsible for the 5-year-old girl who had transformed his life. That night he took her home for good. She held his hand with confidence, a striking contrast to the terrified child who had been taken from that house of horrors months ago. He showed her the room he had prepared, decorated with drawings of birds on the walls, a large window through which she could see the sky, and a soft bed with colorful sheets. The girl looked at everything with wide eyes, then turned to him and asked if it was real, if she could stay forever. He knelt down to her height, his eyes watering, and promised that yes, she was home now, and she would never have to be afraid again. That night, before sleeping, the girl sang her song for the last time, as a reminder of the past. But now, instead of sounding like a lament, it sounded like a celebration. She had flown away from the pain, like the birds she had always drawn, and found, finally, a place where she could land her tired wings and just be a child. The businessman stood watching her sleep peacefully, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt that his life had meaning again. His fortune, his investments, all the wealth he had built, now had a real purpose. To ensure that that child never knew suffering again, that she could grow up surrounded by love and safety. And while the historic town slept under the stars, 2 lives that had been marked by loss and pain found, finally, a new beginning. A beginning built not on empty promises or impossible coincidences, but on difficult choices, belated courage, and the human capacity to transform regret into action. The girl had found a home, and the man had found a reason to live again. And both had learned that sometimes redemption comes when we least expect it, brought by the fragile voice of a child who refused to stop singing, even in the deepest darkness. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.